Tariq Ramadan, we get the point, yeah?
Once again, I think that you are taking one story and then
it was the one she took.
No, it is, and many Muslims around the world and in the Netherlands were against that and attacked the small groups that were saying this. And this is the case today in Europe. The discourse that you have is helping to nurture this sense of alienation and not to let the Muslims feel that they are at home. And out of the questions that we got from here, people are saying, you are welcome here, and then in their own country. I'm sorry, I'm at home. I'm at home. What are you talking about? Don't talk about. So, talk to me, I'm sorry. Talk to us, or talk to me as a fellow European, and not as someone who is an outsider infiltrating the freedom of expression and using this. This is one. Let me finish.
Can I come back to that? No, I'm not saying you're not a European, but I would appreciate the following, which is that don't come to this hall and tell this hall that you're a European, and go to another and talk to an Islamic audience as Islamic brothers. Because that is what you have spent your career doing.
What's wrong?
Speaking through. Let me finish this. And Tariq comes here one day and says, we fellow Europeans, we all speak to each other as fellow Europeans. And another, he speaks to a Muslim audience and says, we as Muslims. Which is it, Tariq? Which is it?
I'm a Muslim.
You can't pretend you have two identities. Come and just
you know what?
Can I say something about
But you are my...
Okay, you two, just a minute. We get your point. Let's see, I mean, Fleming and then Petra. And on this point, on this specific point, can Tariq Ramadan be Muslim and European? And is there a problem with standing with Muslims and saying, I'm a fellow Muslim, but also being European? Douglas seems to have a problem with that.
Of course not. Of course not. But no, I'm not finished. Islam is not a race. And why is this important? Because if it's race, you don't have a chance to change it. I mean, communists were also being discriminated during the Cold War, but that's also an ideology, although another kind of ideology. So you have to insist that Islam is a set of ideas, and you have the freedom to change, to leave, to criticize, to ridicule, and so on and so forth. And it's very, very different
You have
from
problems with freedom of speech and what you've encountered amongst some Muslims, is what you're saying, yeah. Okay, Petra, on this question of identity, I think, was the
Well,
key
I mean,
one.
it almost seems as if the only good Muslim would be an ex-Muslim. And so for me, how enlightened are we if we only welcome people who are like us? I mean, like you and me. I mean, can we actually accept people who think differently? I think this is when our values are really tested. And of course, when people are thinking differently and don't want to change religion, that's also a universal human right.
All right, but Petra, what about one of the questions that we had from the floor, which is somebody expressed the view that women have said that they enjoy more freedom in the Middle East than they do actually when they come to Europe, which is kind of...
In the Netherlands, we have a political party which is in parliament, which doesn't allow women to run for office. And I don't hear the same voices about this party as I hear about Muslim women.
Tariq Ramadan, I do want to ask about women and Islam, because this is something, we've had some contributions from the floor on that, and women wearing their veils and so on. I mean, this is something which does exercise a great deal of debate. The fact that a lot of people feel that you can't be a Muslim woman and enjoy certain freedoms. How do you address that?
No, I think that we have to acknowledge the fact that there are problems, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that things are evolving, that there is and there are Muslim women in Europe today who are leaders in the leadership and coming with new interpretation. When it comes, for example, something which is very simple about the headscarf. It's against Islam to impose it, it's against human rights to take it off. This should be the point, and this is why we should be in agreement. Second point, against forced marriages. We had campaigns in Europe against forced marriages. And then when it comes to anything which has to do with reading the text, being able to come and to get a sense of autonomy for women, this is happening. So I would say that in some countries, you wear the headscarf, by definition, you can't be a free Muslim woman because the way you dress. I think it's wrong. Let the people decide and let them speak for themselves and listen.
Right,
listen, because sometimes they speak and they are not listening.
There's a big debate, I want to talk about you. There's a big debate,
I have a direct question to Tariq. What will you do if you find out that a woman is not wearing that dress by her own choice? What will your opinion be?
It happened, and I did it to, and I said it to some of the, at least now in my mind there are two who asked me about the fact I don't want to wear it, and posed by my father and once by my mother. I said, resist. Don't accept something which is against your freedom, because it has to be your choice and it's an act of faith. So for the dignity of Muslims, you have to resist.
All right, I mean, there's a big debate at the moment in Europe, isn't there, in France in particular, about the niqab, the full face veil, and even people like Rachida Dati, the former French cabinet minister, has said that she is opposed to that. But Douglas, I want to ask you, you heard some of the people from the floor there, the woman complaining about attacks on her because she's described as a scarfie because she wears a head veil. I mean, that is something that you would regret. I mean, that doesn't promote social cohesion.
Nobody thinks that any physical attacks or any such thing could be a good thing to happen. Of course not. Of course there are. Let's make sure we're right.
Talking about
prejudice exists in society. Let's just be absolutely clear as an audience. Prejudice undoubtedly exists in this society. It exists across racial groups, including from minorities to other minorities, after all, which is one of the things we see increasingly in Britain these days. And it is also the case that people, in particularly famously lower socioeconomic groups, are likely to feel hatred for other groups. That is one of the things that has to be tackled, and everyone, I think, in this hall, I'm sure, we're in agreement that that should be tackled. But do not mix up somebody, a thug, a racist, and so on, attacking somebody in a street with the right of Fleming and me to say what we see in the Quran, what we think of Muhammad, and maybe even asserting our right to say so.
Okay, all right, now... All right, the gentleman here.
I think part of the issue here is that at the point where Europe is becoming increasingly secular, there's a group of people who have a tenacious belief in God. And I just wonder whether or not if we had 16 million evangelical Americans moved here, I'd feel exactly the same about that. I don't think it's anything to do with race. Okay,
let's take some from upstairs. Yeah.
The biggest point for me is double standards. I think European double standards is the biggest problem. I mean, you talk of freedom of expression, and yet you kind of like compromise it through banning of minarets. But the point is, okay, people voted for it, fair enough. But the point is, you shouldn't compromise. You shouldn't give people, like, you can discuss taxes, you can discuss anything, but freedom of expression, that is not something that is up for tax. And it's just double standards that the West sort of holds.
Okay.
That.
You're referring to that referendum in Switzerland about...
and quite a lot of them, like the one in France banning burqas.
Okay. Gentleman there.
My name's Henry Hogger. I'm a former British diplomat in the Arab world. I worked until fairly recently for something called the Muslim West Facts Project, which is an exercise to publicise the findings of some Gallup polling on Muslim opinion in Europe. One of the most striking features in that, I think, is that in Britain, France and Germany, that Muslims, when asked for how strongly they feel attached to the country that they live in, on the whole gave stronger answers of loyalty than did the public as a whole, a sample of the public as a whole in those three countries. It seems to me that that's a strong and positive reason for arguing against the motion that Europe is failing its Muslims, but not the reasons which I fear our speakers against the motion have been giving, which rather inclined to blame Islam and Muslims themselves for the problem.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman behind you. I'll come to you in a second.
I do a lot of work with Christians who've come out from the Middle East, sometimes due to persecution, and British policy is frequently behind that. So the world is very complicated. But what worries me is that a lot of the things that people are worried about Muslim immigrants into Europe are very hard attitudes that a lot of the Christians also have. And I think if you are, for instance, from a gay minority in a lot of those communities, it is very, very worrying. And therefore we need to be thinking slightly bigger than just this Muslim thing, but it is about a wider cultural problem.
Right, okay. The lady now, wearing the hat.